Letter 102, Part 1 of Pamela, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pamela, Volume 2, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 102, Part 1. My dear Lady G., I will cheerfully cause to be transcribed for you the conversation you desire between myself, Mrs. Towers, and Lady Arthur, and the three young ladies, their relations, in presence of the Dean and his daughter, and Mrs. Brooks; and glad I shall be, if it may be of use to the two thoughtless misses, your neighbours, who, you are pleased to tell me, are great admirers of my story and my example, and will therefore, as you say, pay greater attention to what I write than to the more passionate and interested lessons of their mamma. I am only sorry you should be concerned about the supposed trouble you give me by having mislaid my former relation of it; for, besides obliging my dear Lady G., the hope of doing service by it to a family so worthy, in a case so nearly affecting its honour, as to make two headstrong young ladies recollect what belongs to their sex and their characters, and what their filial duties require of them, affords me high pleasure; and if it shall be attended with the wished effects, it will add to my happiness. I said cause to be transcribed, because I hope to answer a double end by it; for on reconsideration I set Miss Goodwin to transcribe it, who writes a pretty hand, and is not a little fond of the task, nor indeed of any task I set her, and will be more affected as she performs it, than she could be by reading it only; although she is a very good girl at present, and gives me hopes that she will continue to be so. I will enclose it when done, that it may be read to the parties without this introduction, if you think fit; and you will forgive me for having added a few observations with a view to the cases of your inconsiderate young ladies, and for having corrected the former narrative in several places. My dear Lady G., the papers you have mislaid as to the conversation between me and the young ladies, relations of Mrs. Towers and Lady Anne Arthur, in presence of these two last named ladies, Mrs. Brooks, and the worthy Dean and Miss L., of which, in order to perfect your kind recollection of my communications, you request another copy, contained as follows. I first stated that I had seen these three ladies twice or thrice before, as visitors, at their kinswomen's houses, so that they and I were not altogether strangers to one another; and my two neighbours acquainted me with their respective tastes and dispositions, and their histories preparatory to this visit, to the following effects: that Miss Stapylton is overrun with the love of poetry and romance, and delights in flowery language and metaphorical flourishes; is about 18, wants not either sense or politeness, and has read herself into a vein more amorous (that was Mrs. Towers's word) than discreet; has extraordinary notions of a first sight love, and gives herself greater liberties, with a pair of fine eyes, in hopes to make sudden conquests in pursuance of that notion, than is pretty in her sex and age, which makes those who know her not conclude her bold and forward; and is more than suspected, with a mind thus prepared for instantaneous impressions, to have experienced the argument to her own disadvantage, and to be struck by, before she had stricken, a gentleman, whom her friends think not at all worthy of her, and to whom she was making some indiscreet advances, under the name of Philoclea, to Philoxenus, in a letter which she entrusted to a servant of the family, who, discovering her design, prevented her indiscretion for that time; that in other respects she has no mean accomplishments, will have a fine fortune, is genteel in her person, though with some visible affectation, dances well, sings well, and plays prettily on several instruments; is fond of reading, but affects the action and air, and attitude of a tragedian, and is too apt to give an emphasis in the wrong place in order to make an author mean significantly even where the occasion is common, and in a mere historical fact that requires as much simplicity in the reader's accent as in the writer's style. No wonder, then, that when she reads a play she will put herself into a sweat, as Mrs. Towers says, distorting very agreeable features, and making a multitude of wry mouths with one very pretty one, in order to convince her hearers what a near neighbour her heart is to her lips. Miss Cope is a young lady of 19, lovely in her person, with a handsome fortune in possession, and great prospects; has a soft and gentle turn of mind, which disposes her to be easily imposed upon; is addressed by a libertine of quality, whose courtship, while permitted, was imperiousness, and whose tenderness insult. Having found the young lady too susceptible of impression, open and unreserved, and even valuing him the more, as it seemed, for treating her with ungenerous contempt; for that she was always making excuses for slights, ill manners, and even rudeness, which no other young lady would forgive. That this docility on her side, and this insolence on his, and an over-free and even indecent degree of romping, as it is called with her, which once her mamma surprised them in, made her papa forbid his visits, and her receiving them. That this, however, was so much to Miss Cope's regret, that she was detected in a design to elope to him out of the private garden door, which, had she effected, in all probability, the indelicate and dishonourable peer would have triumphed over her innocence, having given out since that he intended to revenge himself on the daughter for the disgrace he had received from the parents. That though convinced of this, it was feared she still loved him, and would again throw herself in his way, urging that his rash expressions were the effect only of his passion; for that she knows he loves her too well to be dishonourable to her, and by the same degree of favourable prepossession she will have it, that his brutal roughness is the manliness of his nature, that his most shocking expressions are sincerity of heart, that his boasts of former lewdness are but instances that he knows the world, that his freedoms with her person are but excess of love and innocent gaiety of temper, that his resenting the prohibition he has met with, and his threats, are other instances of his love and his courage, and peers of the realm ought not to be bound down by little narrow rules like the vulgar, for truly their honour is in the greatest cases regarded as equal with the oath of a common gentleman, and is a security that a lady may trust to, if he is not a profligate indeed, and that Lord P. cannot be. That, excepting these weaknesses, Miss has many good qualities, is charitable, pious, humane, humble, sings sweetly, plays on the spinnet charmingly, is meek, fearful, and never was resolute or courageous enough to step out of the regular path, till her too flexible heart became touched with a passion that is said to polish the most brutal temper, and therefore her rough peer has none of it, and to animate the dove, of which Miss Cope has too much. That Miss Sutton, a young lady of the like age with the two former, has too lively and airy a turn of mind, affects to be thought well read in the histories of kingdoms, as well as in polite literature, speaks French fluently, talks much upon all subjects, and has a great deal of flippant wit, which makes more enemies than friends; however, is innocent and unsuspectedly virtuous hitherto, but makes herself cheap and accessible to fops and rakes, and has not the worse opinion of a man for being such, listens eagerly to stories told to the disadvantage of some of her own sex, though affecting to be a great stickler for the honour of it in general; will unpityingly propagate them; thinks, without considering to what the imprudence of her own conduct may subject her, the woman that slips inexcusable, and the man who seduces her much less faulty, and thus encourages the one sex in their vileness, and gives up the other for their weakness, in a kind of silly affectation, to show her security in her own virtue, at the same time that she is dancing upon the edge of a precipice, presumptuously inattentive to her own danger. The worthy dean, knowing the lady's intention in this visit to me, brought his daughter with him, as if by accident; for Miss L., with many good qualities, is of a remarkable soft temper, though not so inconsiderately soft as Miss Cope, but is too credulous, and, as her papa suspects, entertains more than a liking to a wild young gentleman, the heir to a noble fortune, who makes visits to her, full of tenderness and respect, but without declaring himself. This gives the dean much uneasiness, and he is very desirous that his daughter should be in my company on all occasions, as she is so kind to profess a great regard to my opinion and judgment. 'Tis easy to see the poor young lady is in love, and she makes no doubt that the young gentleman loves her. But, alas! Why then, for he is not a bashful man, as you shall hear, does he not say so? He has deceived already two young creatures. His father has cautioned the dean against his son, has told him that he is sly, subtle, full of stratagem, yet has so much command of himself, which makes him more dangerous, as not to precipitate his designs, but can wait with patience till he thinks himself secure of his prey, and then pulls off the mask at once, and if he succeeds, glories in his villainy. Yet does his father beg of the dean to permit his visits, for he wishes him to marry Miss L., though greatly unequal in fortune to his son, wishing for nothing so much as that he would marry. And the dean, owing his principal preferment to the old gentleman, cares not to disoblige him, or affront his son without some apparent reason for it, especially as the father is wrapped up in him, having no other child, and being himself half afraid of him, lest, if too much thwarted, he should fly out entirely. So here, madam, are four young ladies of like years, and different inclinations and tempers, all of whom may be said to have dangers to encounter, resulting from their respective dispositions, and who, professing to admire my character and example, were brought to me to be benefited, as Mrs. Towers was pleased to say, by my conversation, and all was to be as if accidental, none of them knowing how well I was acquainted with their several characters. How proud would this compliment have made me from such a lady as Mrs. Towers, had I not been as proud could be before, of the good opinion of four beloved persons, Mr. B., Lady Davers, the Countess of C., and your dear self. We were attended only by Polly Barlow, who in some points was as much concerned as anybody; and this being when Lord and Lady Davers and the noble Countess were with us, 'tis proper to say, they were abroad together upon a visit, from which, knowing how I was to be engaged, they excused me. The dean was well known to and valued by all the ladies, and therefore was no manner of restraint upon the freedom of our conversation. I was in my closet when they came, and Mrs. Towers, having presented each young lady to me when I came down, said, being all seated, "I can guess at your employment, Mrs. B. Writing, I dare say. I have often wished to have you for a correspondent, for every one who can boast of that favour exalts you to the skies, and says your letters exceed your conversation; but I always insisted upon it that was impossible." "Mrs. Towers," said I, "is always saying the most obliging things in the world of her neighbours; but may not one suffer, dear madam, for these kind prepossessions in the opinion of greater strangers, who will judge more impartially than your favour will permit you to do?" "That," said Lady Arthur, "will be so soon put out of doubt when Mrs. B. begins to speak, that we will refer to that, and to put an end to every thing that looks like compliment." "But, Mrs. B.," says Mrs. Towers, "may one ask, what particular subject was at this time your employment?" "I had been writing, you must know, Lady G., for the sake of suiting Miss Stapylton's flighty vein, a little sketch of the style she is so fond of, and hoped for some such opportunity as this question gave me, to bring it on the carpet; for my only fear with her and Miss Cope and Miss Sutton was, that they would deem me too grave, and so what should fall in the course of conversation would make the least impression upon them. For the best instructions, you know, will be ineffectual if the manner of conveying them is not adapted to the taste and temper of the person you would wish to influence. And, moreover, I had a view in it to make this little sketch the introduction to some future observations on the stiff and affected style of romances, which might put Miss Stapleton out of conceit with them, and make her turn the course of her studies another way, as I shall mention in its place. I answered that I had been meditating upon the misfortunes of a fine young lady who had been seduced and betrayed by a gentleman she loved, and who, notwithstanding, had the grace to stop short, indeed later than were to be wished, and to abandon friends, country, lover, in order to avoid any further intercourse with him, and that God had blessed her penitence and resolution, and she was now very happy in a neighbouring dominion. "A fine subject," said Miss Stapleton. "Was the gentleman a man of wit, madam? Was the lady a woman of taste? We condemn every man who dresses well, and is not a sloven, as a fop or a coxcomb. No doubt when this is the case. But you hardly ever saw a man very nice about his person and dress that had anything he thought of greater consequence to himself to regard. 'Tis natural it should be so, for should not the man of body take the greater care to set out and adorn the part for which he thinks himself most valuable? And will not the man of mind bestow his principal care in improving that mind, perhaps to the neglect of dress and outward appearance, which is a fault? But surely, madam, there is a middle way to be observed in these as in most other cases, for a man need not be a sloven, any more than a fop. He need not show an utter disregard to dress, nor yet think it his first and chief concern. Be ready to quarrel with the wind for discomposing his peruke, or fear to put on his hat lest he should depress his foretop. More dislike a spot upon his clothes than in his reputation. Be a self-admirer, and always at the glass, which he would perhaps never look into, could it show him the deformity of his mind, as well as the finery of his person. Who has a tailor for his tutor, and a milliner for his schoolmistress. Who laughs at men of sense, excusably enough, perhaps in revenge, because they laugh at him. Who calls learning pedantry, and looks upon the knowledge of the fashions as the only useful science to a fine gentleman." Pardon me, ladies, I could proceed with the character of this species of men, but I need not; for every lady present would despise such an one as much as I do, were he to fall in her way; or the rather, because he who admires himself will never admire his lady as he ought, and if he maintains his niceness after marriage, it will be with a preference to his own person; if not, will sink very probably into the worst of slovens. For whoever is capable of one extreme, take almost the cases of human life through, when he recedes from that, if he be not a man of prudence, will go over into the other. But to return to the former subject, for the general attention encouraged me to proceed, permit me, Miss Sutton, to add, that a lady must run great risks to her reputation, if not to her virtue, who will admit into her company any gentleman who shall be of opinion, and know it to be hers, that it is his province to ask a favour which it will be her duty to deny. I believe, madam, I spoke these words a little too carelessly, but I meant honourable questions, to be sure. "There can be but one honourable question," replied I, "and that is seldom asked, but when the affair is brought near a conclusion, and there is a probability of its being granted, and which a single lady, while she has parents or guardians, should never think of permitting to be put to herself, much less of approving, nor perhaps, as the case may be, of denying. But I make no doubt that you meant honourable questions. A young lady of Miss Sutton's good sense and worthy character could not mean otherwise. And I have said perhaps more than I need upon the subject, because we all know how ready the presuming of the other sex are, right or wrong, to construe the most innocent meetings in favour of their own views." "Very true," said she, but appeared to be under an agreeable confusion, every lady by her eye seeming to think she had met with a deserved rebuke, and which, not seeming to expect it, abated her liveliness all the time after. Mrs. Towers seasonably relieved us both from a subject too applicable, if I may so express it, saying, "But, dear Mrs. B., will you favour us? with the result of your meditation, if committed to writing on the unhappy case you mentioned. I was rather, madam, exercising my fancy than my judgment, such as it is, upon the occasion. I was aiming at a kind of allegorical or metaphorical style, I know not which to call it, and it is not fit to be read before such judges, I doubt. "Oh, pray, dear madam," said Miss Stapylton, "favour us with it to choose, for I am a great admirer of that style." "I have a great curiosity," said Lady Arthur, "both from the subject and the style, to hear what you have written, and I beg you will oblige us all." "It is short and unfinished. It was written for the sake of a friend who is fond of such a style, and what I shall add to it will be principally some slight observations upon this way of writing. But let it be ever so censurable, I should be more so if I made any difficulties after such an unanimous request." So taking it out of my letter case, I read as follows: "While the banks of discretion keep the proud water of passion within their natural channel, all calm and serene glides along the silver current, enlivening the adjacent meadows as it passes with a brighter and more flowery verdure. But if the torrents of sensual love are permitted to descend from the hills of credulous hope, they may so swell the gentle stream as to make it difficult, if not impossible, to be retained betwixt its usual bounds. What then will be the consequence? Why, the trees of resolution and the shrubs of cautious fear, which grew upon the frail mound, and whose intertwining roots had contributed to support it, being loosened from their hold, they, and all that would swim of the bank itself, will be seen floating on the surface of the triumphant waters. But here a dear lady, having unhappily failed, is enabled to set her foot in the new-made breach, while yet it is possible to stop it, and to say, with little variation in the language of that power which only could enable her to say it, 'Hither, ye proud waves of dissolute love, although you have come, yet no farther shall ye come,' is such an instance of magnanimous resolution and self-conquest as is very rarely to be met with. Miss Stapylton seemed pleased, as I expected, and told me that she should take it for a high favour to be permitted, if not improper, to see the whole letter when finished. I said I would oblige her with all my heart; but you must not expect, madam, that although I have written what I have read to you, I shall approve of it in my observations upon it; for I am convinced that no style can be proper which is not plain, simple, easy, natural, and unaffected. She was sure, she was pleased to say, that whatever my observations were, they would be equally just and instructive. I too, said the dean, will answer for that; for I dare say, by what I have already heard, that Mrs. B. will distinguish properly between the style, and the matter too, which captivates the imagination, and that which informs the judgment. Our conversation after this took a more general turn, which I thought right, lest the young ladies should imagine it was a designed thing against them. Yet it was such, that every one of them found her character and taste little or much concerned in it, and all seemed, as Mrs. Towers afterwards observed to me, by their silence and attention, to be busied in private applications. The dean began it with a high compliment to me, having a view, no doubt, by his kind praises, to make my observations have the greater weight upon the young ladies. He said, it was matter of great surprise to him, that my tender years considered, I should be capable of making those reflections, by which persons of twice my age and experience might be instructed. You see, madam, said he, our attention, when your lips begin to open, and I beg we may have nothing to do, but to be attentive. I have had such advantages, sir, from the observations and cautions of my late excellent lady, that did you but know half of them, you would rather wonder I had made no greater improvement, than that I have made so much. She used to think me pretty, and not ill-tempered, and of course not incredulous, where I conceived a good opinion; and was always arming me on that side, as believing I might be the object of wicked attempts, and the rather as my low fortune subjected me to danger. For had I been born to rank and condition, as these young ladies here, I should have had reason to think of myself, as justly as, no doubt, they do, and of consequence beyond the reach of any vile intriguer; as I should have been above the greatest part of that species of mankind, who, for want of understanding or honour, or through pernicious habits, give themselves up to libertinism. "These were great advantages," said Miss Sutton, "but in you they met with a surprising genius. 'Tis very plain, madam, that there is not, in my opinion, a lady of England of your years who would have improved by them as you have done." I answered that I was much obliged by her good opinion, and that I had always observed the person who admired any good qualities in another gave a kind of natural demonstration that she had the same in an eminent degree herself, although perhaps her modest diffidence would not permit her to trace the generous principle to its source. The dean, to renew the subject of credulity, repeated my remark that it was safer, in cases where so much depended upon the issue as a lady's honour and reputation, to fear an enemy than to hope a friend, and praised my observation that even a weak enemy is not to be too much despised. I said I had very high notions of the honour and value of my own sex, and very mean ones of the gay and frothy part of the other, insomuch that I thought they could have no strength but what was founded in our weakness, that the difference of education must give men advantages, even where the genius is naturally equal. Besides, they have generally more hardness of heart, which makes women, where they meet not with men of honour, engage with that sex upon very unequal terms. For that it is so customary with them to make vows and promises, and to set light by them, when made, that an innocent lady cannot guard too watchfully against them, and, in my opinion, should believe nothing they said, or even vowed, but what carried demonstration with it. I remember my lady used often to observe, "There is a time of life in all young persons which may properly be called the romantic, which is a very dangerous period, and requires, therefore, a great guard of prudence, that the risk is not a little augmented by reading novels and romances, and the poetical tribe have much to answer for, by reason of their heightened and inflaming descriptions, which do much hurt to thoughtless minds and lively imaginations; for to those, she would have it, are principally owing the rashness and indiscretion of soft and tender dispositions, which, in breach of their duty, and even to the disgrace of their sex, too frequently set them upon enterprises like those they have read in those pernicious writings, which not seldom make them fall a sacrifice to the base designs of some wild intriguer, and even in cases where their precipitation ends the best, that is to say, in marriage, they too frequently, in direct opposition to the cautions and commands of their tried, their experienced and unquestionable friends, throw themselves upon an almost stranger, who, had he been worthy of them, would not, nor needed to have taken indirect methods to obtain their favour. And the misfortune is, the most innocent are generally the most credulous. Such a lady would do no harm to others, and cannot think others would do her any. And as to the particular person who has obtained perhaps a share in her confidence, he cannot, she thinks, be so ungrateful as to return irreparable mischief for her good will to him. Were all the men in the world besides to prove false, the beloved person cannot. 'Twould be unjust to her own merit, as well as to his views, to suppose it; and so design on his side, and credulity and self-opinion on the lady's, at last enroll the unhappy believer in the list of the too late repenters. "And what, madam," said the dean, "has not that wretch to answer for, who makes sport of destroying a virtuous character, and in being the wicked means of throwing perhaps upon the town, and into the dregs of prostitution, a poor creature, whose love for him, and confidence in him, was all her crime, and who otherwise might have made a worthy figure at the head of a reputable family, and so have been an useful member of the commonwealth, propagating good examples, instead of ruin and infamy to mankind; to say nothing of, what is still worse, the dreadful crime of occasioning the loss of a soul, since final impenitence too generally follows the first sacrifice which the poor wretch is seduced to make of her honour." "There are several gentlemen in our neighbourhood," said Mrs. Brooks, "who might be benefited by this touching reflection, if represented in the same strong lights from the pulpit; and I think, Mr. Dean, you should give us a sermon upon this subject, for the sake of both sexes, one for caution, the other for conviction." "I will think of it," replied he; "but I am sorry to say that we have too many among our younger gentry who would think themselves pointed at, were I to touch this subject ever so cautiously." I am sure, said Mrs. Towers, there cannot well be a more useful one, and the very reason the Dean gives is a convincing proof of it to me. When I have had the pleasure of hearing the further sentiments of such an assembly as this, upon the delicate subject, replied this polite divine, I shall be better enabled to treat it. And pray, ladies, proceed, for it is from your conversation that I must take my hints. You have only, then, said Mrs. Towers, to engage Mrs. B. to speak, and you may be sure we will all be as attentive to her as we shall be to you, when we have the pleasure to hear so fine a genius improving upon her hints from the pulpit. End of letter 102, part 1. Letter 102, part 2 of Pamela, volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pamela, volume 2 by Samuel Richardson. Letter 102, part 2. I bowed to Mrs. Towers, and knowing she praised me with the Dean's view, in order to induce the young ladies to give the greater attention to what she wished me to speak, I said, it would be a great presumption in me, after so high a compliment, to open my lips. Nevertheless, as I was sure, by speaking I should have the benefit of instruction, whenever it made them speak, I would not be backward to enter upon any subject, for that I should consider myself as a young counsel in some great cause, who served but to open it, and prepare the way for those of greater skill and abilities. I beg then, madam, said Miss Stapleton, you will open the cause, be the subject what it will, and I could almost wish that we had as many gentlemen here as ladies, who would have reason to be ashamed of the liberties they take in censuring the conversations of the tea-table, since the pulpit, as the worthy Dean gives us reason to hope, may be beholden to that of Mrs. B. Nor is it much wonder, replied I, when the Dean himself is with us, and it is graced by so distinguished a circle. If many of our young gentlemen were here, said Mrs. Towers, they might improve themselves in all the graces of polite and sincere complaisance. But compared to this, I have generally heard such trite and coarse stuff from our race of would-be wits, that what they say may be compared to the fawnings and salutations of the ass in the fable, who, emulating the lapdog, merited a cudgel rather than encouragement. But, Mrs. B., continued she, begin, I pray you, to open and proceed in the cause, for there will be no counsel employed but you, I can tell you. Then give me a subject that will suit me, ladies, and you shall see how my obedience to your commands will make me run on. Will you, madam, said Miss Stapleton, give us a few cautions and instructions on a theme of your own, that a young lady should rather fear too much than hope too much? A necessary doctrine, perhaps, but a difficult one to be practised by one who has begun to love, and who supposes all truth and honour in the object of her favour. Hope, madam, said I, in my opinion, should never be unaccompanied by fear. And the more reason will a lady ever have to fear, and to suspect herself, and doubt her lover, when she once begins to find in her own breast an inclination to him, for then her danger is doubled, since she has herself, perhaps the more dangerous enemy of the two, to guard against as well as him. She may secretly wish the best indeed, but what has been the fate of others may be her own, and though she thinks it not probable from such a faithful protester as he appears to her to be, yet while it is possible, she should never be off her guard. Nor will a prudent woman trust to his mercy or honour, but to her own discretion, and the rather, because if he mean well, he himself will value her the more for her caution, since every man desires to have a virtuous and prudent wife. If not well, she will detect him the sooner, and so by her prudence frustrate all his base designs. But let me, my dear ladies, ask what that passion is which generally we dignify by the name of love, and which, when so dignified, puts us upon 1,000 extravagances. I believe, if examined into, it would be found too generally to owe its original to ungoverned fancy, and were we to judge of it by the consequences that usually attend it, it ought rather to be called rashness, inconsideration, weakness, and anything but love, for very seldom, I doubt, is the solid judgment so much concerned in it as the airy fancy. But when once we dignify the wild misleader with the name of love, all the absurdities which we read in novels and romances take place, and we are induced to follow examples that seldom end happily but in them. But permit me further to observe that love, as we call it, operates differently in the two sexes as to its effects. For in woman it is a creeping thing, in a man an encroacher, and this ought, in my humble opinion, to be very seriously attended to. Miss Sutton intimated thus much when she observed that it was the man's province to ask, the ladies to deny. Excuse me, madam, the observation was just as to the men's notions, although methinks I would not have a lady allow of it, except in cases of caution to themselves. The doubt, therefore, which a lady has of her lover's honour is needful to preserve her own and his too. And if she does him wrong, and he should be too just to deceive her, she can make him amends, by instances of greater confidence when she pleases. But if she has been accustomed to grant him little favours, can she easily recall them? And will not the encroacher grow upon her indulgence, pleading for a favour to-day, which was not refused him yesterday, and reproaching her want of confidence as a want of esteem, till the poor lady, who perhaps has given way to the creeping, insinuating passion, and has avowed her esteem for him, puts herself too much in his power, in order to manifest, as she thinks, the generosity of her affection, and so by degrees is carried farther than she intended, or nice honour ought to have permitted, and all because, to keep up to my theme, she hopes too much, and doubts too little. And there have been cases where a man himself, pursuing the dictates of his encroaching passion, and finding a lady too conceding, has taken advantages, of which probably at first he did not presume to think. Miss Stapylton said that virtue itself spoke when I spoke, and she was resolved to recollect as much of this conversation as she could, and write it down in her commonplace book, where it would make a better figure than anything she had there. "I suppose, miss," said Mrs. Towers, "your chief collections are flowers of rhetoric, picked up from the French and English poets and novel writers. I would give something for the pleasure of having it 2 hours in my possession." "Fie, madam," replied she, a little abashed, "how can you expose your kinswoman thus before the Dean and Mrs. B?" "Mrs. Towers," said I, "only says this to provoke you to show your collections. I wish I had the pleasure of seeing them. I doubt not but your commonplace book is a storehouse of wisdom." "There is nothing bad in it, I hope," replied she, "but I would not that Mrs. B. should see it for the world. But, madam," to Mrs. Towers, "there are many beautiful things, and good instructions to be collected from novels and plays, and romances, and from the poetical writers, particularly, light as you are pleased to make of them. Pray, madam," to me, "have you ever been at all conversant in such writers?" "Not a great deal in the former. There were very few novels and romances that my lady would permit me to read, and those I did gave me no great pleasure, for either they dealt so much in the marvellous and improbable, or were so unnaturally inflaming to the passions, and so full of love and intrigue, that most of them seemed calculated to fire the imagination rather than to inform the judgment. Titles and tournaments, breaking of spears in honour of a mistress, engaging with monsters, rambling in search of adventures, making unnatural difficulties in order to show the knight-errant's prowess in overcoming them, is all that is required to constitute the hero in such pieces. And what principally distinguishes the character of the heroine is, when she is taught to consider her father's house as an enchanted castle, and her lover as the hero who is to dissolve the charm, and to set at liberty from one confinement, in order to put her into another, and to probably a worse, to instruct her how to climb walls, leap precipices, and do 20 other extravagant things, in order to show the mad strength of a passion she ought to be ashamed of, to make parents and guardians pass for tyrants, the voice of reason to be drowned in that of indiscreet love, which exalts the other sex and debases her own. And what is the instruction that can be gathered from such pieces for the conduct of common life? Then have I been ready to quarrel with these writers for another reason, and that is the dangerous notion which they hardly ever fail to propagate of a first-sight love, for there is such a susceptibility supposed on both sides, which, however it may pass in a man, very little becomes the female delicacy, that they are smitten with a glance. The fictitious blind god is made a real divinity, and too often prudence and discretion are the first offerings at his shrine. "I believe, madam," said Miss Stapylton, blushing and playing with her fan, "there have been many instances of people's loving at first sight, which have ended very happily." "No doubt of it," replied I, "but there are 3 chances to 1 that so precipitate a liking does not. For where can be the room for caution, inquiry, the display of merit and sincerity, and even the assurance of a grateful return, to a lady who thus suffers herself to be prepossessed? Is it not a random shot? Is it not a proof of weakness? Is it not giving up the negative voice, which belongs to the sex, even while she is not sure of meeting with the affirmative one from him, whose affection she wishes to engage? Indeed, ladies," continued I cannot help concluding, and I am the less afraid of speaking my mind, because of the opinion I have of the prudence of every lady that hears me, that where this weakness is found, it is no way favourable to a lady's character, nor to that discretion which ought to distinguish it. It looks to me as if a lady's heart were too much in the power of her eye, and that she had permitted her fancy to be much more busy than her judgment." Miss Stapylton blushed and looked around her. "But I observe," said Mrs. Towers, "whenever you censure any indiscretion, you seldom fail to give cautions how to avoid it. And pray let us know what is to be done in this case, that is to say, how a young lady ought to guard against and overcome the first favourable impressions." "What I imagine," replied I, "a young lady ought to do, on any the least favourable impressions of the kind, is immediately to withdraw into herself, as one may say, to reflect upon what she owes to her parents, to her family, to her character, and to her sex, and to resolve to check such a random prepossession, which may much more probably, as I hinted, make her a prey to the undeserving than otherwise, as there are so many of that character to one man of real merit. The most that I apprehend a first-sight approbation can do is to inspire a liking, and a liking is conquerable, if the person will not brood over it till she hatches it into love. Then every man and woman has a black and a white side, and it is easy to set the imperfections of the person against the supposed perfections, while it is only a liking. But if the busy fancy be permitted to work as it pleases, uncontrolled, then 'tis very likely, were the lady but to keep herself in countenance for receiving first impressions, she will see perfections in the object which no other living soul can, and it may be expected that as a consequence of her first indiscretion she will confirm, as an act of her judgment, what her wild and ungoverned fancy had misled her to think of with so much partial favour. And too late, as it probably may happen, she will see and lament her fatal and perhaps undutiful error. "We are talking of the ladies only," added I, for I saw Miss Stapylton was become very grave; "but I believe first sight love often operates too powerfully in both sexes, and where it does so, it will be very lucky if either gentleman or lady find reason, on cool reflection, to approve a choice which they were so ready to make without thought." "'Tis allowed," said Mrs. Towers, "that rash and precipitate love may operate pretty much alike in the rash and precipitate of both sexes, and whichsoever loves generally exalts the person beloved above his or her merits. But I am desirous, for the sake of us maiden ladies, since it is a science in which you are so great an adept, to have your advice, how we should watch and guard its first encroachments, and that you will tell us what you apprehend gives the men most advantage over us." "Nay, now, Mrs. Towers, you rally my presumption indeed." "I admire you, madam," replied she, "in every thing you say and do, and I won't forgive you to call what I so seriously say and think raillery. For my own part," continued she, "I never was in love yet, nor, I believe, were any of these young ladies." Miss Cope looked a little silly upon this. "And who can better instruct us to guard our hearts than a lady who has so well defended her own?" "Why then, madam, if I must speak, I think what gives the other sex the greatest advantage over even many of the most deserving ones, is that dangerous foible, the love of praise, and the desire to be flattered and admired, a passion I have observed to predominate more or less from 16 to 60 in most of our sex. We are too generally delighted with the company of those who extol our graces of person or mind, for will not a grateful lady study hard to return a few compliments to a gentleman who makes her so many? She is concerned to prove him a man of distinguished sense, or a polite man, at least in regard to what she thinks of herself, and so the flatterer shall be preferred to such of the sincere and worthy as cannot say what they do not think. And by this means many an excellent lady has fallen a prey to some sordid designer. Then I think nothing can give gentlemen so much advantage over our sex, as to see how readily a virtuous lady can forgive the capital faults of the most abandoned of the other, and that sad, sad notion, that a reformed rake makes the best husband; a notion that has done more hurt and discredit, too, to our sex, as it has given more encouragement to the profligate, and more discouragement to the sober gentlemen, than can be easily imagined. A fine thing indeed, as if the wretch, who had run through a course of iniquity to the endangering of soul and body, was to be deemed the best companion for life to an innocent and virtuous young lady, who is to owe the kindness of his treatment to her to his having never before accompanied with a modest woman, nor till his interest on one hand, to which his extravagance perhaps compels him to attend, and his impaired constitution on the other, oblige him to it, so much as wished to accompany with one, and who always made a jest of the marriage state, and perhaps of everything, either serious or sacred." "You observe very well," said Mrs. Towers, "but people will be apt to think that you have less reason than any of our sex to be severe against such a notion. For who was a greater rake than a certain gentleman, and who is a better husband?" "Madam," replied I, "the gentleman you mean never was a common town rake. He is a man of sense and fine understanding, and his reformation, secondarily, as I may say, has been the natural effect of those extraordinary qualities. But also I will presume to say, that that gentleman, as he has not many equals in the nobleness of his nature, so he is not likely, I doubt, to have many followers, in a reformation begun in the bloom of youth, upon self-conviction, and altogether, humanly speaking, spontaneous. Those ladies who would plead his example in support of this pernicious notion should find out the same generous qualities in the man before they trust to it, and it will then do less harm, though even then I could not wish it to be generally entertained. "It is really unaccountable," said Mrs. Towers. "After all, as Mrs. B., I remember, said on another occasion, that our sex should not as much insist upon virtue and sobriety in the character of a man, as a man, be he ever such a rake, does in that of a lady. And 'tis certainly a great encouragement to libertinism, that a worn-out debauchee should think himself at any time good enough for a husband, and have the confidence to imagine that a modest woman will accept of his address with a preference of him to any other." "I can account for it but one way," said the dean, "and that is, that a modest woman is apt to be diffident of her own merit and understanding, and she thinks this diffidence an imperfection. A rake never is troubled with it, so he has in perfection a quality she thinks she wants, and knowing too little of the world, imagines she mends the matter by accepting of one who knows too much." "That's well observed, Mr. Dean," said Mrs. Towers, "but there is another fault in our sex, which Mrs. B. has not touched upon, and that is, the foolish vanity some women have in the hopes of reforming a wild fellow, and that they shall be able to do more than any of their sex before them could do, a vanity that often costs them dear, as I know in more than one instance." "Another weakness," said I, "might be produced against some of our sex, who join too readily to droll upon and sneer at the misfortune of any poor young creature who has shown too little regard for her honour, and who, instead of speaking of it with concern, and inveighing against the seducer, too lightly sport with the unhappy person's fall, industriously spread the knowledge of it." I would not look upon Miss Sutton while I spoke this, and avoid her as one infected, and yet scruple not to admit into their company the vile aggressor, and even to smile with him at his barbarous jests upon the poor sufferer of their own sex. "I have known 3 or 4 instances of this in my time," said Mrs. Towers, "that Miss Sutton might not take it to herself, for she looked down and was a little serious." "This," replied I, "puts me in mind of a little humorous copy of verses, written, as I believe, by Mr. B., and which, to the very purpose we are speaking of, he calls, 'Benefit of making others' misfortunes our own.' Thou'st heard it, or read it, 1,000,000 of times, that men are made up of falsehood and crimes. Search all the old authors, and ransack the new, thou'lt find in love stories scarce one mortal true. Then why this complaining, and why this wry face? Is it 'cause thou'rt affected most with thy own case? Hadst thou sooner made others' misfortunes thy own, thou never thyself this disaster hadst known. Thy compassionate caution had kept thee from evil, and thou mightst have defied mankind and the devil." The ladies were pleased with the lines, but Mrs. Towers wanted to know at what time of Mr. B.'s life they could be written. "Because," added she, "I never suspected before that the good gentleman ever took pains to write cautions or exhortations to our sex, to avoid the delusions of his own." These verses, and these facetious but severe remarks of Mrs. Towers, made every young lady look up with a cheerful countenance, because it pushed the ball from self, and the dean said to his daughter, "So, my dear, you, that have been so attentive, must let us know what useful inferences you can draw from what Mrs. B. and the other ladies so excellently said." I observe, sir, from the faults the ladies have so justly imputed to some of our sex, that the advantage the gentlemen chiefly have over us is from our own weakness, and that it behooves a prudent woman to guard against first impressions of favour, since she will think herself obliged, in compliment to her own judgment, to find reasons, if possible, to confirm them. But I wish to know if there be any way that a woman can judge whether a man means honourably or not in his address to her. Mrs. B. can best inform you of that, Miss L., said Mrs. Towers. What say you, Mrs. B.? There are a few signs, answered I, easy to be known, and I think almost infallible. Pray let's have them, said Lady Arthur, and they all were very attentive. I lay it down as an undoubted truth, said I, that true love is one of the most respectful things in the world. It strikes with awe and reverence the mind of the man who boasts its impressions. It is chaste and pure in word and deed, and cannot bear to have the least indecency mingled with it. If therefore a man, be his birth or quality what it will, the higher, the worse, presume to wound a lady's ears with indecent words; if he endeavour, in his expressions or sentiments, to convey gross or impure ideas to her mind; if he is continually pressing for her confidence in his honour; if he requests favours which a lady ought to refuse; if he can be regardless of his conduct or behaviour to her; if he can use boisterous or rude freedoms either to her person or dress. Here poor Miss Cope by her blushes bore witness to her case. If he avoids speaking of marriage, when he has a fair opportunity of doing it. Here Miss L. looked down and blushed. Or leaves it once to a lady to wonder that he does not. In any or in all these cases he is to be suspected, and a lady can have little hope of such a person, nor, as I humbly apprehend, consistent with honour and discretion, encourage his address. The ladies were so kind as to applaud all I said, and so did the Dean. Miss Stapleton, Miss Cope, and Miss L. were to write down what they could remember of the conversation, and our noble guests coming in soon after, with Mr. B., the ladies would have departed, but he prevailed upon them to pass the evening, and Miss L., who had an admirable finger on the harpsichord, as I have before said, obliged us with 2 or 3 lessons. Each of the ladies did the like, and prevailed upon me to play a tune or two, but Miss Cope, as well as Miss L., surpassed me much. We all sung, too, in turns, and Mr. B. took the violin, in which he excels. Lord Davers obliged us on the violoncello. Mr. H. played on the German flute, and sung us a fop song, and performed it in character, so that we had an exceeding gay evening, and parted with great satisfaction on all sides, particularly on the young ladies; for this put them all in good humour and good spirits, enlivening the former scene, which otherwise might have closed, perhaps more gravely than efficaciously. The distance of time since this conversation passed enables me to add what I could not do when I wrote the account of it, which you have mislaid, and which take briefly as follows. Miss Stapleton was as good as her word, and wrote down all she could recollect of the conversation; and I having already sent her the letter she desired, containing my observations upon the flighty style she so much admired, it had such an effect upon her as to turn the course of her reading and studies to weightier and more solid subjects, and avoiding the gentleman she had begun to favour, gave way to her parents' recommendations, and is happily married to Sir Jonathan Barnes. Miss Cope came to me a week after, with the leave of both her parents, and tarried with me 3 days, in which time she opened all her heart to me, and returned in such a disposition, and with such resolutions, that she never would see her peer again, nor receive letters from him, which she owned to me she had done clandestinely before, and she is now the happy lady of Sir Michael Beaumont, who makes her the best of husbands, and permits her to follow her charitable inclinations, according to a scheme which she consulted me upon. Miss L., by the Dean's indulgent prudence and discretion, has escaped her rake, and upon the discovery of an intrigue he was carrying on with another, conceived a just abhorrence of him, and is since married to Dr. Jenkins, as you know, with whom she lives very happily. Miss Sutton is not quite so well off as the three former, though not altogether so unhappy neither, in her way. She could not indeed conquer her love of dress and tinsel, and so became the lady of Colonel Wilson, and they are thus far easy in the marriage state, that being seldom together, they have probably a multitude of misunderstandings. For the Colonel loves gaming, in which he is generally a winner, and so passes his time mostly in town. His lady has her pleasures, neither laudable nor criminal ones, which she pursues in the country, and now and then a letter passes on both sides, by the inscription and subscription of which they remind one another that they have been once in their lives at one church together. And what now, my dear Lady G., have I to add to this tedious account? For letter I can hardly call it, but that I am, with great affection, your true friend and servant, P.B. End of letter 102, Part 2. Letter 103 of Pamela, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pamela, Volume 2, by Samuel Richardson. Letter 103. My dear Lady G. You desire to have a little specimen of my nursery tales and stories, with which, as Miss Fenwick told you, on her return to Lincolnshire, I entertain my Miss Goodwin and my little boys. But you make me too high a compliment when you tell me it is for your own instruction and example. Yet you know, my dear Lady G., be your motives what they will, I must obey you, although were others to see it, I might expose myself to the smiles and contempt of judges less prejudiced in my favour. So I will begin without any further apology, and, as near as I can, give you those very stories with which Miss Fenwick was so pleased, and of which she has made so favourable a report. Let me acquaint you, then, that my method is to give characters of persons I have known in one part or other of my life, in feigned names, whose conduct may serve for imitation or warning to my dear attentive Miss; and sometimes I give instances of good boys and naughty boys for the sake of my Billy and my Davers, and they are continually coming about me. Dear Madam, a pretty story, now cries Miss, and dear mamma, tell me of good boys and of naughty boys, cries Billy. Miss is a surprising child of her age, and is very familiar with many of the best characters in the Spectators, and having a smattering of Latin, and more than a smattering of Italian, and being a perfect mistress of French, is seldom at a loss for a derivation of such words as are not of English original. And so I shall give you a story in feigned names, with which she is so delighted that she has written it down. But I will first trespass on your patience with one of my childish tales. Every day, once or twice, I cause Miss Goodwin, who plays and sings very prettily, to give a tune or two to me, my Billy, and my Davers, who, as well as my Pamela, love and learn to touch the keys, young as the latter is, and she will have a sweet finger, I can observe that, and a charming ear, and her voice is music itself. Oh, the fond, fond mother, I know you will say, on reading this. Then, madam, we all proceed hand in hand together to the nursery, to my Charley and Jemmy, and in this happy retirement, so much my delight in the absence of my best beloved, imagine you see me seated, surrounded with the joy and the hope of my future prospects, as well as my present comforts. Miss Goodwin, imagine you see on my right hand, sitting on a velvet stool, because she is eldest, and a miss, Billy on my left in a little cane elbow chair, because he is eldest and a good boy, my Davers and my sparkling-eyed Pamela, with my Charlie between them, on little silken cushions at my feet, hand in hand, their pleased eyes looking up to my more delighted ones, and my sweet-natured promising Jemmy in my lap. The nurses and the cradle just behind us, and the nursery maids delightedly pursuing some useful needlework for the dear charmers of my heart, all as hush and as still as silence itself, as the pretty creatures generally are when their little watchful eyes see my lips beginning to open, for they take neat notice already of my rule of 2 ears to 1 tongue, insomuch that if Billy or Davers are either of them for breaking the mum, as they call it, they are immediately hush at any time if I put my finger to my lip, or if Miss points hers to her ear, even to the breaking of a word in two, as it were. And yet all my boys are as lively as so many birds, while my Pamela is cheerful, easy, soft, gentle, always smiling, but modest and harmless as a dove. I began with a story of 2 little boys and 2 little girls, the children of a fine gentleman and a fine lady, who loved them dearly. That they were all so good, and loved one another so well, that everybody who saw them admired them, and talked of them far and near, that they would part with anything to the another, loved the poor, spoke kindly to the servants, did everything they were bid to do, were not proud, knew no strife, but who should learn their books best, and be the prettiest scholar, that the servants loved them, and would do anything they desired, that they were not proud of fine clothes, that let not their heads run upon their playthings when they should mind their books, said grace before they eat, their prayers before they went to bed, and as soon as they rose were always clean and neat, would not tell a fib for the world, and were above doing anything that required one. That God bless them more and more, and bless their papa and mamma, and their uncles and aunts and cousins for their sakes. And there was a happy family, my dear loves, no one idle, all prettily employed, the masters at their books, the misses at their books too, or at their needles, except at their play hours, when they were never rude, nor noisy, nor mischievous, nor quarrelsome, and no such word was ever heard from their mouths as, "Why mayn't I have this or that, as well as Billy or Bobby?" or "Why should Sally have this or that any more than I?" But it was "as my mamma pleases, my mamma knows best," and a bow and a smile, and no surliness or scowling brow to be seen, if they were denied anything, for well did they know that their papa and mamma loved them so dearly, that they would refuse them nothing that was for their good. And they were sure when they were refused, they asked for something that would have done them hurt, had it been granted. Never were such good boys and girls as these. And they grew up, and the masters became fine scholars and fine gentlemen, and everybody honoured them. And the misses became fine ladies and fine housewives. And this gentleman, when they grew to be women, sought to marry one of the misses, and that gentleman the other. And happy was he that could be admitted into their companies, so that they had nothing to do but to pick and choose out of the best gentlemen in the country; while the greatest ladies for birth, and the most remarkable for virtue, which, my dears, is better than either birth or fortune, thought themselves honoured by the addresses of the 2 brothers; and they married, and made good papas and mammas, and were so many blessings to the age in which they lived. There, my dear loves, were happy sons and daughters, for good masters seldom fail to make good gentlemen, and good misses good ladies, and God blesses them with as good children as they were to their parents, and so the blessing goes round. Who would not but be good? "Well, but, mamma, we will all be good, won't we, Master Davers?" cries my Billy. "Yes, brother Billy, but what will become of the naughty boys? Tell us, mamma, about the naughty boys." "Why, there was a poor widow woman who had 3 naughty sons and 1 naughty daughter, and they would do nothing that their mamma bid them do, were always quarrelling, scratching, and fighting, would not say their prayers, would not learn their books, so that the little boys used to laugh at them and point at them as they went along for blockheads, and nobody loved them or took notice of them except to beat and thump them about for their naughty ways and their undutifulness to their poor mother, who worked hard to maintain them. As they grew up, they grew worse and worse, and more stupid and ignorant, so that they impoverished their poor mother, and at last broke her heart, poor widow woman. And her neighbours joined together to bury the poor widow woman, for these sad ungracious children made away with what little she had left while she was ill, before her heart was quite broken, and this helped to break it the sooner, for had she lived, she saw she must have wanted bread, and had no comfort with such wicked children. Poor widow woman, said my Billy with tears, and my little dove shed tears too, and Davers was moved, and Miss wiped her fine eyes. But what became of the naughty boys and the naughty girl, mamma? Became of them? Why, one son was forced to go to sea, and there he was drowned. Another turned thief, for he would not work, and he came to an untimely end. The third was idle and ignorant, and nobody, who knew how he used his poor mother, would employ him, and so he was forced to go into a far country and beg his bread. And the naughty girl, having never loved work, pined away in sloth and filthiness, and at last broke her arm, and died of a fever, lamenting too late that she had been so wicked a daughter to so good a mother. And so there was a sad end to all the four ungracious children, who never would mind what their poor mother said to them, and God punished their naughtiness, as you see, while the good children I mentioned before were the glory of their family, and the delight of everybody that knew them. Who would not be good, was the inference, and the repetition from Billy, with his hands clapped together, poor widow woman, gave me much pleasure. So my childish story ended with a kiss of each pretty dear, and their thanks for my story, and then came on Mrs. request for a woman's story, as she called it. I dismissed my babies to their play, and taking Mrs. hand, she standing before me, all attention, began in a more womanly strain to her, for she is very fond of being thought a woman, and indeed is a prudent, sensible dear, comprehends anything instantly, and makes very pretty reflections upon what she hears or reads, as you will observe in what follows. There is nothing, my dear Miss Goodwin, that young ladies should be so watchful over as their reputation. 'Tis a tender flower that the least frost will nip, the least cold wind will blast, and when once blasted it will never flourish again, but wither to the very root. But this I have told you so often, I need not repeat what I have said. So to my story. There were four pretty ladies lived in one genteel neighbourhood, daughters of four several families, but all companions and visitors, and yet all of very different inclinations. Coquetilla we will call one, Prudiana another, Profusiana the third, and Prudentia the fourth, their several names denoting their respective qualities. Coquetilla was the only daughter of a worthy baronet, by a lady very gay, but rather indiscreet than unvirtuous, who took not the requisite care of her daughter's education, but let her be overrun with the love of fashion, dress, and equipage; and when in London, balls, operas, plays, the park, the ring, the withdrawing room, took up her whole attention. She admired nobody but herself, fluttered about, laughing at and despising a crowd of men followers, whom she attracted by gay, thoughtless freedoms of behaviour, too nearly treading on the skirts of immodesty. Yet made she not one worthy conquest, exciting, on the contrary, in all sober minds, that contempt of herself which she so profusely would be thought to pour down upon the rest of the world. After she had several years fluttered about the dangerous light, like some silly fly, she at last singed the wings of her reputation, For being despised by every worthy heart, she became too easy and cheap a prey to a man the most unworthy of all her followers, who had resolution and confidence enough to break through those few cobweb reserves in which she had encircled her precarious virtue, and which were no longer of force to preserve her honour, when she met with a man more bold and more enterprising than herself, and who was as designing as she was thoughtless. And what then became of Coquetilla? Why, she was forced to pass over sea to Ireland, where nobody knew her, and to bury herself in a dull obscurity, to go by another name, and at last, unable to support a life so unsuitable to the natural gaiety of her temper, she pined herself into a consumption, and died, unpitied and unlamented, among strangers, having not one friend but whom she bought with her money. "Poor Lady Coquetilla," said Miss Goodwin, "what a sad thing it is to have a wrong education! And how happy am I, who have so good a lady to supply the place of a dear distant mamma! But be pleased, madam, to proceed to the next." Prudiana, my dear, was the daughter of a gentleman who was a widower, and had, while the young lady was an infant, buried her mamma. He was a good sort of man, but had but one lesson to teach to Prudiana, and that was to avoid all sort of conversation with the men; but never gave her the right turn of mind, nor instilled into it that sense of her religious duties which would have been her best guard in all temptations; for, provided she kept out of the sight and conversation of the gentlemen, and avoided the company of those ladies who more freely conversed with the other sex, it was all her papa desired of her. This gave her a haughty, sullen, and reserved turn, made her stiff, formal, and affected. She had sense enough to discover early the faults of Coquetilla, and in dislike to them fell the more easily into that contrary extreme, which a recluse education and her papa's cautions naturally led her; so that pride, reserve, affectation, and censoriousness made up the essentials of her character, and she became more unamiable even than Coquetilla; and as the other was too accessible, Prudiana was quite unapproachable by gentlemen, and unfit for any conversation but that of her servants, being also deserted by those of her own sex, by whom she might have improved on account of her censorious disposition. And what was the consequence? Why this: every worthy person of both sexes despising her, and she being used to see nobody but servants, at last throws herself upon one of that class. In an evil hour she finds something that is taking to her low taste in the person of her papa's valet, a wretch so infinitely beneath her, but a gay coxcomb of a servant, that everybody attributed to her the scandal of making the first advances, for otherwise it was presumed he durst not have looked up to his master's daughter. So here ended all her pride. All her reserves came to this: her censoriousness of others redoubled people's contempt upon herself, and made nobody pity her. She was finally turned out of doors without a penny of fortune. The fellow was forced to set up a barber's shop in a country town, for all he knew was to shave and dress a peruke, and her papa would never look upon her more, so that Prudiana became the outcast of her family, and the scorn of all that knew her, and was forced to mingle in conversation and company with the wretches of her husband's degree. "Poor miserable Prudiana," said Miss, "what a sad, sad fall was hers, and all owing to the want of a proper education too, and to the loss of such a mamma as I have an aunt, and so wise a papa as I have an uncle. How could her papa, I wonder, restrain her person as he did, like a poor nun, and make her unacquainted with the generous restraints of the mind? I am sure, my dear good aunt, it will be owing to you that I shall never be a Coquetilla nor a Prudiana neither. Your table is always surrounded with the best of company, with worthy gentlemen as well as ladies, and you instruct me to judge of both and of every new guest in such a manner as makes me esteem them all and censure nobody, but yet to see faults in some to avoid, and graces in others to imitate, but in nobody but yourself and my uncle anything so like perfection as shall attract one's admiration to one's own ruin. You are young yet, my love, and must always doubt your own strength, and pray to God more and more, as your years advance, to give you more and more prudence and watchfulness over your conduct. But yet, my dear, you must think justly of yourself too, for let the young gentleman be ever so learned and discreet, your education entitles you to think as well of yourself as of them. For don't you see the ladies who are so kind as to visit us, that have not been abroad, as you have been, when they were young, yet make as good figures in conversation, say as good things as any of the gentlemen? For, my dear, all that the gentlemen know more than the ladies, except here and there such a one as your dear uncle, with all their learned education, is only that they have been disciplined, perhaps into an observation of a few accuracies in speech, which, if they know no more, rather distinguish the pedant than the gentleman, such as the avoiding of a false concord, as they call it, and which you know how to do as well as the best, not to put a was for a were, an are for an is, and to be able to speak in mood and tense, and such like valuable parts of education, so that, my dear, you can have no reason to look upon that sex in so high a light as to depreciate your own. And yet you must not be proud, nor conceited neither, but make this one rule your guide. In your maiden state, think yourself above the gentlemen, and they'll think you so too, and address you with reverence and respect, if they see there be neither pride nor arrogance in your behaviour, but a consciousness of merit, a true dignity, such as becomes virgin modesty, and untainted purity of mind and manners, like that of an angel among men. For so young ladies should look upon themselves to be, and will then be treated as such by the other sex. In your married state, which is a kind of state of humiliation for a lady, you must think yourself subordinate to your husband, for so it has pleased God to make the wife. You must have no will of your own in petty things, and if you marry a gentleman of sense and honour, such a one as your uncle, he will look upon you as his equal, and will exalt you the more for your abasing yourself. In short, my dear, he will act by you, just as your dear uncle does by me, and then what a happy creature will you be! So I shall, madam, to be sure I shall. But I know I shall be happy whenever I marry, because I have such wise directors, and such an example before me. And if it please God, I will never think of any man, in pursuance of your constant advice to young ladies at the tea-table, who is not a man of sense, and a virtuous gentleman. But now, dear madam, for your next character, there are 2 more yet to come. That's my pleasure. I wish there were 10. Why, the next was Profusiana. You may remember, my love, Profusiana took another course to her ruin. She fell into some of Coquetilla's foibles, but pursued them for another end, and in another manner. Struck with the grandeur and magnificence of what weak people call the upper life, she gives herself up to the circus, to balls, to operas, to masquerades and assemblies, affects to shine at the head of all companies, at Tunbridge, at Bath, and every place of public resort, plays high, is always receiving and paying visits, giving balls, and making treats and entertainments, and is so much above the conduct which mostly recommends a young lady to the esteem of the deserving of the other sex, that no gentleman who prefers solid happiness can think of addressing her, though she is a fine person and has many outward graces of behaviour. She becomes the favourite toast of the place she frequents, is proud of that distinction, gives the fashion, and delights in the pride, that she can make apes in imitation whenever she pleases, but yet endeavouring to avoid being thought proud, makes herself cheap, and is the subject of the attempts of every coxcomb of eminence, and, with much ado, preserves her virtue, though not her character. What all this while is poor Profusiana doing? She would be glad, perhaps, of a suitable proposal, and would, it may be, give up some of her gaieties and extravagances; for Profusiana has wit, and is not totally destitute of reason, when she suffers herself to think. But her conduct procures her not one solid friendship, and she has not in a 12-month, among 1,000 professions of service, one devoir that she can attend to, or a friend that she can depend upon. All the women she sees, if she excels them, hate her. The gay part of the men, with whom she accompanies most, are all in a plot against her honour. Even the gentlemen, whose conduct in the general is governed by principles of virtue, come down to these public places to partake of the innocent freedoms allowed there, and oftentimes give themselves airs of gallantry, and never have it in their thoughts to commence a treaty of marriage with an acquaintance begun upon that gay spot. What solid friendships and satisfactions, then, is Profusiana excluded from? Her name, indeed, is written in every public window, and prostituted, as I may call it, at the pleasure of every profligate or sot, who wears a diamond to engrave it, and that it may be, with most vile and barbarous imputations and freedoms of words, added by rakes, who very probably never exchanged a syllable with her. The wounded trees are perhaps also taught to wear the initials of her name, linked, not unlikely, and widening as they grow, with those of a scoundrel. But all this while she makes not the least impression upon one noble heart; and at last, perhaps, having run on to the end of an uninterrupted race of follies, she is cheated into the arms of some vile fortune hunter, who quickly lavishes away the remains of that fortune which her extravagance had left, and then, after the worst usage, abandoning her with contempt, she sinks into an obscurity that cuts short the thread of her life, and leaves no remembrance but on the brittle glass, and still more faithless bark, that ever she had a being. "Alas, alas! what a butterfly of a day," said Miss, an expression she remembered of Lady Towers, "was poor Profusiana! What a sad thing to be so dazzled by worldly grandeur, and to have so many admirers, and not one real friend!" "Very true, my dear, and how carefully ought a person of a gay and lively temper to watch over it, and what a rock may public places be to a lady's reputation, if she be not doubly vigilant in her conduct, when she is exposed to the censures and observations of malignant crowds of people, many of the worst of whom spare the least those who are most unlike themselves." "But then, madam," said Miss, "would Profusiana venture to play at public places? Will ladies game, madam? I have heard you say that lords and sharpers, but just out of liveries, in gaming are upon a foot in every thing, save that one has nothing to lose, and the other much, besides his reputation. And will ladies so disgrace their characters and their sex as to pursue this pernicious diversion in public?" "Yes, my dear, they will too often. The more's the pity. And don't you remember, when we were at Bath, in what a hurry I once passed by some knots of genteel people, and you asked what those were doing? I told you whisperingly they were gaming, and loath I was that my Miss Goodwin should stop to see some sights to which, till she arrived at the years of discretion, it was not proper to familiarize her eye. in some sort of acting like the ancient Romans, who would not assign punishments to certain atrocious crimes because they had such an high idea of human nature as to suppose it incapable of committing them. So I was not for having you, while a little girl, see those things which I knew would give no credit to our sex, and which I thought, when you grew older, should be new and shocking to you. But now you are so much a woman in discretion, I may tell you anything." She kissed my hand, and made me a fine curtsy, and told me that now she longed to hear of Prudentia's conduct. "Her name, madam," said she, "promises better things than those of her 3 companions, and so it had need. For how sad is it to think that out of 4 ladies of distinction, 3 of them should be naughty, and of course unhappy." "These 2 words, 'of course,' my dear," said I, "were very prettily put in. Let me kiss you for it, since every one that is naughty, first or last, must be certainly unhappy." Far otherwise than what I have related was it with the amiable Prudentia. Like the industrious bee, she makes up her honey hoard from every flower, bitter as well as sweet. For every character is of use to her, by which she can improve her own. She had the happiness of an aunt who loved her, as I do you, and of an uncle who doted on her, as yours does. For, alas, poor Prudentia lost her papa and mamma almost in her infancy in 1 week, but was so happy in her uncle and aunt's care, as not to miss them in her education, and but just to remember their persons. By reading, by observation, and by attention, she daily added new advantages to those which her education gave her. She saw and pitied the fluttering freedoms and dangerous nights of Coquetilla, the sullen pride, the affectation, and stiff reserves which Prudiana assumed, she penetrated and made it her study to avoid. And the gay, hazardous conduct, extravagant temper, and love of tinselled grandeur, which were the blemishes of Profusiana's character, she dreaded and shunned. She fortifies herself with the excellent examples of the past and present ages, and knows how to avoid the faults of the faulty, and to imitate the graces of the most perfect. She takes into her scheme of that future happiness, which she hopes to make her own, what are the true excellencies of her sex, and endeavours to appropriate to herself the domestic virtues which shall one day make her the crown of some worthy gentleman's earthly happiness, and which, of course, as you prettily said, my dear, will secure and heighten her own. That noble frankness of disposition, that sweet and unaffected openness and simplicity which shines in all her actions and behaviour, commend her to the esteem and reverence of all mankind, as her humility and affability, and a temper uncensorious, and ever making the best of what she said of the absent person of either sex, due to the love of every lady. Her name indeed is not prostituted on windows, nor carved on the barks of trees in public places, but it smells sweet to every nostril, dwells on every tongue, and is engraven on every heart. She meets with no address but from men of honour and probity. The fluttering coxcomb, the inveigling parasite, the insidious deceiver, the mercenary fortune hunter, spread no snares for a heart guarded by discretion and prudence as hers is. They see that all her amiable virtues are the happy result of an uniform judgment, and the effects of her own wisdom, founded in an education to which she does the highest credit. And at last, after several worthy offers, enough to perplex a lady's choice, she blesses some one happy gentleman, more distinguished than the rest for learning, good sense, and true politeness, which is but another word for virtue and honour, and shines to her last hour in all the duties of domestic life as an excellent wife, mother, mistress, friend, and Christian, and so confirms all the expectations of which her maiden life had given such strong and such edifying presages. Then, folding my dear Miss in my arms, and kissing her, tears of pleasure standing in her pretty eyes, who would not, said I, shun the examples of the Coquetillas, the Prudianas, and the Profusianas of this world, and choose to imitate the character of Prudentia, the happy and the happy-making Prudentia. "Oh, madam, madam," said the dear creature, smothering me with her rapturous kisses, "Prudentia is you! Is you, indeed! It can be nobody else! Oh, teach me, good God, to follow your example, and I shall be a second Prudentia. Indeed I shall. God send you May, my beloved Miss, and may he bless you more, if possible, than Prudentia was blessed. And so, my dear Lady G., you have some of my nursery tales, with which, relying on your kind allowances and friendship, I conclude myself your affectionate and faithful P.B. End of letter 103. Conclusion of Pamela, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pamela, Volume 2, by Samuel Richardson. Conclusion. The editor thinks proper to conclude in this place, that he may not be thought to deserve a suspicion that the extent of the work was to be measured by the patience of its readers, but he thinks it necessary, in order to elucidate the whole, to subjoin a note of the following facts. Mr. B., after the affair which took date at the masquerade, and concluded so happily, continued to be one of the best and most exemplary of men, an honour to his country, both in his public and private capacity, having, at the instances of some of his friends in very elevated stations, accepted of an honourable employment abroad in the service of the state, which he discharged in such a manner as might be expected from his qualifications and knowledge of the world. And on his return, after an absence of 3 years, resisting all the temptations of ambition, devoted himself to private duties, and joined with his excellent lady in every pious wish of her heart, adorning the married life with all the warmth of an elegant tenderness, beloved by his tenants, respected by his neighbours, revered by his children, and almost adored by the poor, in every county where his estates gave him interest, as well as for his own bountiful temper, as for the charities he permitted to be dispensed with so liberal a hand by his lady. She made him the father of 7 fine children, 5 sons and 2 daughters, all adorned and accomplished by nature, to be the joy and delight of such parents, being educated in every respect by the rules of their inimitable mother, laid down in that book, which she mentions to have been written by her for the revisal and correction of her consort, the contents of which may be gathered from her remarks upon Mr. Locke's treatise on education, in her letters to Mr. B., and in those to Lady G. Miss Goodwin, at the age of 18, was married to a young gentleman of fine parts, and great sobriety and virtue, and both she and he, in every material part of their conduct, and in their behaviour to one another, emulate the good example set them by Mr. and Mrs. B. Lord Davers dying 2 years before this marriage, his lady went to reside at the Hall in Lincolnshire, the place of her birth, that she might enjoy the company and conversation of her excellent sister, who, for conveniency of the chapel, and advantage of room and situation, had prevailed upon Mr. B. to make it the chief place of his residence, and there the noble lady lived long, in the strictest friendship with the happy pair, an honourable relict of her affectionate lord. The worthy Mr. Andrews and his wife lived together in the sweet tranquillity set forth in their letters, for the space of 12 years, at the Kentish farm. The good old gentlewoman died first, full of years and comfort, her dutiful daughter performing the last pious offices to so beloved and so loving a parent. Her husband survived her about a year only. Lady G. Miss Darnford, that was, after a happy marriage of several years, died in childbed of her fourth child, to the inexpressible concern of her affectionate consort, and of her dear friend Mrs. B. Lord H., after having suffered great dishonour by the ill courses of his wife, and great devastations in his estate, through her former debts and continued extravagance, intimidated and dispirited by her perpetual insults, and those of her gaming brother, who with his bullying friends terrified him into their measures, threw himself upon the protection of Mr. B., who by his spirit and prudence saved him from utter ruin, punished his wife's accomplices, and obliged her to accept a separate maintenance, and then, taking his affairs into his own management in due course of time, entirely re-established them, and after some years, his wife dying, he became wiser by his past sufferings, and married a second of Lady Davers's recommendation, who, by her prudence and virtue, made him happy for the remainder of his days. Mr. Longman lived to a great age in the worthy family, much esteemed by every one, having trained up a diligent youth, whom he had recommended to ease him in his business, and who, answering expectation, succeeded him in it after his death. He dying rich, out of his great love and gratitude to the family, in whose service he had acquired most of his fortune, and in disgust to his nearest relations, who had perversely disobliged him, he bequeathed to 3 of them £100 apiece, and left all the rest to his honoured principal, Mr. B., who, as soon as he came to know it, being at that time abroad, directed his lady to call together the relations of the old gentleman, and after touching them to the heart with a just and effectual reproof, and finding them filled with due sense of their demerit, which had been the cause of their suffering, then to divide the whole, which had been left him, among them, in greater proportions as they were more nearly related. An action worthy prayers and blessings, not only of the benefited, but of all who heard of it. For it is easy to imagine how cheerfully and how gracefully his benevolent lady discharged a command so well suited to her natural generosity. The End. End of conclusion. End of Pamela, Volume 2, by Samuel Richardson.